Welcome back to CIO Leadership Live. I'm David Binning, Associate Editor with CIO Australia. And joining me now is Kudzai Kanhutu, who's a Dean with the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, an infectious diseases expert with Royal Melbourne Hospital, and also working with community health non-for-profit Co-Health. Kudzai, welcome to CIO Leadership Live.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, big, broad, bold question. I just want to hear from you, to get an understanding from you. How would you describe this journey of digital health in the nearly 3 years since the onset of the pandemic?
Oh, you start with the easy, focused question. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look,
nothing that you could prepare for. Yeah.
I think it's been a real flourishing, hey, and for a lot of us who've worked in this space for years and decades, it was finally the clarion call was heard and things happened for the first time in ways that were just unimaginable before the pandemic. Whether it was telehealth items for phone and for video as well that were no longer, geographically restricted. The ability for, people to actually be able to attend, audit forums virtually. I think there'll be countless clinicians who will recall times where you had to attend for various meetings at 7:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning in person, and the enormous strain and stress that put on, families, relationships, and that work-life balance. And then just the extraordinary wins for things like e-prescribing and patients actually being able to get e-scripts done and taking a lot of that sort of slog work of making your care connect just magically getting solved at scale and consistently across the system was like really incredible. And
yeah, you've talked about this digital prescription. I mean, obviously that's kind of linked into with the broader kind of discussion about electronic health records. I know that this is something that you have very strong views about. You've definitely been at the coalface in standing up electronic health records in Victoria, and also for our viewers, particularly those not in Australia, it should be reinforced that Victoria, in particular Melbourne, was probably had the toughest time throughout COVID with the harshest lockdowns and therefore vastly greater challenges in sort of enabling your workforce. But coming back to the electronic records, to what extent do you think COVID has really advanced that kind of, that aspect of health in Australia?
I think it made people really acutely aware of where they had deficiencies in their systems, and at the same time gave them the impetus and also the strategic imperative and momentum to get things fixed and to start plugging the gaps. And for some practices, it was just simply pushing forward the agenda around moving things to cloud because people wanted to be able to work remotely from home. And Victoria is case in point. I can't tell you the number of people who used to work in businesses that traditionally would not do work from home, just never going to happen, who now have completely flipped, and people have been able to move closer to family, move out of Melbourne Central and actually continue to work post-pandemic. And a lot of that is now sort of starting to be renegotiated in terms of how many days are okay for you to be on site versus off site. But a real pivoting towards making health something that is embedded within all workplaces, that the fact that you are sick should be respected, and that once we've gotten over the immediacy of COVID, and I thank you for noting that Victoria really did it tough. We really did. And I think out of that has come a new appreciation of the things that maybe we can afford to keep from the pandemic. And if you're looking at the patient-facing aspects of it and electronic health records and electronic medical records, it also has pushed some organisations, for example, Parkville Precinct, who were already further ahead that road, has also pushed them to consider new models of care that were being sort of nibbled at the edges of, but then really pushed them into fast forward. So, Hospital in the Home had a massive expansion of virtual care beds, mirroring some of the work that had already started to happen at RPA Virtual in Sydney, for example. And it just meant that everybody was really able to push the dial because the urgency and the immediacy of what was needed demanded it. There were no sort of negotiations around should we or shouldn't we. It was, we're going to have to do it anyway, and now at least we have a really good reason and we can bring people in and resources to make it happen. And now it's just a case of what do we keep and what do we sort of shelve, or what still needs a little bit of rework and a little bit of engineering to optimize the user experience for patients as well as clinicians.
Yeah, sure. As a journalist and an editor with CIO, I've written many times that, industry, insert name, industry X is transformed like no other, has been utterly, turned upside down through the process of being through the pandemic and the deployment of digital tools in order to facilitate it. Do you feel, and I'm sure you probably will answer in the affirmative, perhaps you're biased, though, that perhaps healthcare has been the industry most transformed by the kind of digital tools that have been sort of rapidly scaled up throughout the pandemic? Because you're talking about an industry that really, and you know about this more than most people, you're talking about an industry where there's almost a sort of perverse paradox in healthcare where you've got, people like yourselves, doctors in particular, that have a fairly low base level of technical proficiency. Like, a lot of people accuse doctors of being Luddites. And of course, many of us are incredulous about that. How could you have that much knowledge and do that much study and then not really know how to use your PC? So you had that kind of challenge as well, of course, as bringing patients along the journey, and then an enormous workforce as well.
I expect to say that healthcare was the place that was transformed the most, but I'm going to actually say no, because that tendency towards reversion to the mean and reversion to conservative models of care is really strong, and it's deeply embedded. We were still, there were still many people, myself included, who did actually yearn for things to go back to a little bit more of normal, because we all have patients with whom digital technology is a part of the matrix of care delivery, but it cannot be the sole thing. You really need that flexibility to be able to do procedures or to have that tactile element of care. So immediately, yes, lots of things changed overnight and magic happened in the healthcare sector. But I actually feel that there are many other sectors that were really deeply impacted and are still trying to figure out how to recover from that, and maybe don't have that primacy of attention and care that they should have in terms of how to do that post-trauma disaster recovery. And I'll put case in point, early childhood learning and education are really top of the list for me in terms of industries that were deeply disrupted and have not had the measure of care and attention and focus and ongoing focus on how to care for a group who don't traditionally have a voice of their own. Babies, toddlers, people who were basically born into a world where they didn't get any of the normal structural supports for being healthy and well. So that's me kind of looking at it from a health perspective. That is where I think we need to continue to prosecute the argument around what digitally worked, what really didn't, and how do we do that catch up for children.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it's somewhat remiss of me is to not note that you are a CIO 50 alumni, placed number 10 in 2020, as well as all the credentials that I announced at the top of the program. You are also a mother, so and have those insights into the education system as well. So I'm amazed you found time for us.
That's the thing, right? If you got working parents, you get extra ninja Jedi skills for fitting things in. Extra
ninja Jedi skills. Love it. So you mentioned a moment ago that, that along the journey, it's not been perfect. There's always going to be room for improvement. You're really right at the vanguard of this kind of area of discovery in digital health. With respect to telehealth, which is probably the aspect that most people are familiar with and the platform through which most people would engage with the health system. What sort of improvements are you sort of hoping to see down the track, and what kind of technologies do you expect to kind of, bring to that task of, that sort of iterative improvement of the telehealth experience?
There's this stack. There's the technology stack, which has improved vastly. And I think most people say their experience of Zoom and other platforms has improved, and each of the vendors have really done as much as they can to try and improve the experience of being online and doing online meetings, whether it was the addition of, polls and tools and little stickers and filters to make it feel more fun. That's been done really well. But what sits behind that from a patient perspective and the patient-clinician interaction is that there are still a lot of basic infrastructure needs that have not been met. Yeah. So I have still have many patients who are glitchy. There's a lot of jitter, burst, lag because their internet plans are not set up in such a way that it actually supports them to do good, synchronous, internet mediated connection. Some platforms as well still work better on different browsers compared to others, or have a real kind of black hole for certain devices that just don't work well with some of the telehealth platforms that we use in clinical care.
Yep.
That for me is kind of unacceptable, that if you've got a cheaper phone, you might be the one person who really struggles to have a good experience virtually because it's been configured for people who are using kind of high-end packages, and the systems will degrade properly and will kind of compensate for you not having a great setup. That is a problem. Access to basic infrastructure for internet mediated conversations and interactions. The other bit that is still a little bit broken is the end-to-end experience of a virtual interaction. It should be possible to go from point A, which is I've put in the referral, I've been seen, and now I'm getting my medications without actually having to see or touch another person if that is clinically appropriate. That is clearly still not the case. There are lots of medications that for whatever reason you cannot actually get delivered to your home, and there is still that requirement for somebody to jump out of the virtual world and into the real world in order to access things. We now have that level of finesse and skill in terms of cyber and identity authentication that it should be possible to do that, but that application just hasn't moved over to the healthcare space. There is still that the final mile is still you walk by foot, you go get your things. So it's just that joining of technology that has cropped up and has really taken pace in other sectors like finance to then come across to healthcare to make that authentication process really seamless and less clunky. And I know I've spoken about multi-factor authentication and some of the ways that feels as an end user. It can just really be grubby. It feels not a good vibe. And it also makes people at higher risk of trying to get around that. So finding their manual workaround. I'm going to dip into Google now or just into a non-secure site because at least it's not going to ask me 50 million questions about cookies or I'm like, cookies, they're not real cookies. It's just a word. It's not tasty. It's not nice. But it just kind of breaks down and degrades that experience a little bit. And then there's the topic I always talk about is about creating inclusive digital spaces and places around language. Still predominantly Anglo-centric, a lot of the ways that we do digital health. It's not great if you have any sort of able-bodied and Anglo-centric development of processes and systems in healthcare is still pervasive. But in saying that, there were some real highlights for me in terms of some of the COVID task forces that were set up around data and actually collecting data and sharing data across different parts of government in order to build a clearer and a better picture of where there were unmet needs at community level. So a lot of that was fantastic, innovative, bringing technology in and really pushing the envelope, but there are still lots of places where it's like the infrastructure's crap, the target audience is very narrow and focused at a majority able-bodied English-speaking person, and that's not fair, it's not equitable, and it's unhealthy.
I mean, it's probably fair to say that pre-COVID, well, I certainly know from conversations I've had with other people working in health and digital health, that pre-COVID there was almost a sense of resignation about the lack of integration and within different platforms and data repositories within the healthcare system. Do you think now that with COVID, even though we're probably just still at the beginning of a very steep learning curve, that perhaps we weren't even on that learning curve pre-COVID at all?
It was very ad hoc. So different contexts, different organisations were further along the road and had committed themselves to, they had legacy systems, but they've gone, we don't have budget. Yes, we're dealing with legacy systems, but if we just build a bit of integration or move this bit into cloud, then we'll be able to create a systems architecture that makes more sense and is easier to navigate. So I wouldn't say that people weren't really on the road, but I think what it has done is has normalised that conversation at board level, because COVID put everything on the table for people to see and contend with. That, hey, we're having to deal with partner X who is in a rural regional hospital. We're not going to be able to get that patient transferred. what can we do to work around it so that we can actually information or data share more seamlessly, and what are some of the technical workarounds for this geographic distance that is now a fixed one? It's just going to be really hard for us to move people around. So it just helped to normalise and to sort of elevate that conversation to be more of a boardroom and a strategic conversation, rather than just something that happens with the tech people when they're meeting for their various committees and forums.
Yeah, and of course, as we know, and you and I have discussed this in the past, the previous federal government had a fairly ambitious goal of creating a national electronic health record, very, very large in the scope. There've been some that have been critical of it. For you in Victoria, you've embraced the EPIC electronic health record, EMR. I understand that's also been adopted in New South Wales. Does that sort of tell you that, with kind of projects of that scale, that they seem to work better kind of maybe in isolation with smaller teams, perhaps learning iteratively how they would sort of work in practice, rather than, as we're seeing, the kind of questionable success of the giant, hey, let's just create a national electronic medical record?
That is always really challenging, right? Because it's a tale of two states. So if you looked at Victoria and the New South Wales example, New South Wales always, to me, or in the last couple of decades, have always maintained that ethos of, we want everybody to be on the same system. We have New South Wales eHealth, and we look after the whole state, and everybody needs to be on roughly the same system, which up until now has been Cerner. And now they've made the decision to flip to Epic. Victoria, on the other hand, went with a very devolved model where people got to choose a system that was fit for them. And the consequences of that has been, yes, some projects, for example, the Parkville Precinct one, has been fantastically successful, run very cohesively across a tight geographic zone with a lot more direct line of sight in terms of outcomes, deliverables, and being able to pivot really quickly within that smaller community. So there are clearly advantages to both. The advantages of the whole system-wide, or your large-scale integrated system, one bucket of data, is that then it's a lot easier to share, and it's also a lot easier to function with a distributed workforce, because I can move someone from Wollongong to, the New South Wales border, and they'll be okay. They go to Wagga because they're used to dealing with that system. Whereas in Victoria, there's some hospitals I just think it'll take me weeks to figure out how to work in their systems, because I've never used that particular platform or that system before.
Yeah.
And it's a real system risk, right? So there are pros and cons to both. But I think the overarching story is that technology moves at such a pace now that you can't afford to ever wed yourself to a single solution, and to just expect that if you keep pushing for long enough, that whole kind of sunk cost phenomena, that if you keep pushing for long enough, it will eventually work, because something will inevitably happen that will completely scupper that. And what you need to actually be ready for is, if I can't use this system tomorrow for whatever reason, what is my plan A, B, C, and D? And what is my kind of next step move? And in doing that, how would I work to keep staff, patients, and communities safe when that is happening? For example, if we do get to the point where the whole state of New South Wales is on Epic, what if there is a major cyber disaster? What plans have been put in place for patients to either have capacity to retain their own information so that they can still turn up to their GP and go, hey, don't worry, systems crash statewide, but I've got my little pocket of data here and I can still get on with it, and I can show you everything that I need to show you, and that we're developing systems that are resilient and robust, rather than just kind of pursuing an agenda of, oh, this thing must work in its current form. It's more, it must work well enough, and if the wheels fall off, we are intelligent enough and have developed systems that devolve power and that information enough for a continuity plan to actually be able to be maintained and to keep going.
You mentioned, you're talking about multi-factor authentication and other sort of authentication practices being clunky and sort of not very personal in the health sector. To what extent do you think people like yourselves face unique cybersecurity challenges in healthcare in terms of bringing your colleagues and your clients, your customers, kind of along on the journey? Is it kind of, you seem to be suggesting that it's particularly difficult. On the one hand, you're trying to have patients feeling, comfortable and cared for, and then on the other, kind of having them sort of march through these fairly kind of, but particularly if they're elderly people or perhaps disabled people or mentally disabled people or people with mental health, having them walk through fairly sort of rigid kind of frameworks for cyber. Is that a problem, particularly in health, do you think?
The problem with security of health data is it's not just the technical aspect of how does it feel when I'm interacting with my data, it's the sensitivity around it as well. A lot of the patients I deal with have what I'd class as really sensitive, highly sensitive conditions, sexually transmitted infections, for example, where there's going to be a long story behind that and also trauma that sits behind that. It's not like someone looking over your shoulder and seeing your bank balance, which might be embarrassing for some. Like if I'm a multimillionaire, you don't want people looking over your shoulder going, what? She's minted. Okay. But it's just, how do you respect that and make sure that it's secure, but also do it in such a way where over time it does become a little bit more seamless. So it's not multiple hurdles that you have to jump over in order to access the information and access it quickly. And the classical case example of that is, most EMRs now within a hospital, if there is something that is behind a wall or has been secured for reasons of sensitivity, that there are pretty fast protocols now for doing a break glass so that you can actually break through and access that information within that context. But some of those processes still just kind of haven't been worked through in terms of what is the right set point and to what extent would you allow an individual to say, look, I frankly don't care if anybody does look at this information. I'm happy to just kind of have it just in an app form on my phone and I just touch it, I do my biometrics and then I'm in and I can see it. And that's always that tension of vendor needs, governance needs, system needs, and not creating a wormhole whereby you've made it so loose at the user end and you haven't tightened it up and it actually allows a gateway for someone to then get into the whole system of data because you've made it too loose. And that's just healthcare, right? There's so many stakeholders, and I think we all appreciate that at some point you're always going to have that tension of making it easy enough to access, but not so easy that it's actually a wormhole through which people can then hack a whole system. And that's where I think the conversation needs to get to, is how much information would we allow an individual person to have that is their own data that they control. And then they, for all intents and purposes, can then set the privacy settings for themselves and go, look, this is something I own. It's actually on my device now. It's not somehow connected via cloud to someone else's data or a larger data pool. And it's now just on my phone and I can use it and navigate it safely on my device. And if it gets lost, it's just me who's at risk, not, the whole world might just get hacked because I was loose with the way I do things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of telling, I suppose, that with the Medibank hack, which is quite recent, still quite raw for everybody, that was of medical data. To what extent do you think that has really provided a jolt maybe to people like yourselves and others who have responsibility for cybersecurity in healthcare? I mean, the blowback has been absolutely enormous.
Yeah, I think the thing that's always really interesting with those sort of first-time large-scale precedents in our jurisdiction is what it does is it then sets a precedent in terms of what the government response can or should be. So if we think about Optus, for example, which was not too far before that,
No.
What happened there was that you actually had a situation where government said, okay, fine, it's happened, but you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay for everybody to get all their documents back and you're going to fix it. Once that precedent has been set, that then has the flow-on effect of companies and organisations going, oh, crikey, if it happens with us, can we actually afford to have to, cost recover for people to solve that? And that can go one of two ways. It can either make people be more diligent and take better care of data, but it can also make people shut down the walls as well and make it harder for patients, for example, to access their information. So it's always that kind of duality of what is the response going to be? Is it measured? Is it fair? And for health data, does it continue to keep patients' best interests in mind, or does it actually revert to a point where we'll go back to loss of integration because people are too afraid of being hacked or somebody getting in and accessing information, which is detrimental, because we end up back where we started, which is, no, we don't let anybody share, we don't do any integration, we don't do any data sharing because we're afraid somebody will come in and take the lot.
I suspect that the genie's out of the bottle, though. I don't think we're going to get that genie back in the bottle in terms of this impetus for the sharing of medical data and all of the benefits that will spring from that. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, once, at the beginning of COVID, I had a colleague of mine who had a holiday planned at Rottnest Island. And she said, what do you think? This is in Victoria. I said, oh, what do you reckon? Do you reckon I'll be able to go? And I was like, yeah, they'll never shut down the borders. Come on. Right? And what happened? That's exactly what happened. So I don't think I would, after the experience of COVID, I don't think I would ever be so bold as to say that won't happen, because at the end of the day, when people are struck with an unexpected, your 0-day event, things like that could happen. And I think we need to keep that in mind, and also remember that even when it's happened, it can be undone. But never, I never say never to anything anymore. Not after the last 3 years. Anything's possible, even when, and everything that you assumed was normal and expected, and that I could go, 6 kilometres from my house to go visit a friend. No.
It's a frightening concept, the closure of digital health borders.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that, and you continue the good work with your colleagues. It's been amazing following your journey over the last couple of years. Kudzai Kanhutu, thanks so much for joining us on CIO Leadership Live.
Thank you for having me.